The coffee was lukewarm by the time I finished my rounds at Mercy Heart Clinic. I'd made it at 6 that morning, before Sophia woke, before the chaos of getting her dressed and fed and ready for school began. She'd complained about her lunch again. Too many vegetables, not enough of the cookies I'd hidden at the bottom of the container. I'd kissed her forehead and promised to fix it tomorrow, knowing full well I'd do the exact same thing because children needed nutrition more than they needed my capitulation to their preferences. At 32, I'd learned patience in ways I never anticipated as a younger woman. Patience with difficult patients. Patience with insurance companies that denied necessary procedures. Patience with myself for choices that had seemed logical at the time, but now haunted quiet moments between work and sleep. The clinic was situated in a renovated brownstone on Beacon Hill, the kind of place that whispered old money and careful discretion. My colleagues didn't ask many questions about my background. One of them, Dr. Harrison, had been instrumental in my arrival here 7 years and 9 months ago. He'd known people who knew people, the sort of network that existed in whispered conversations and handshake agreements that never made it to paper. When I'd come to him terrified and desperate, my world collapsing around shoulders too young to carry such weight, he'd listened without judgment and moved mountains. The pregnancy had been the catalyst for everything, not the pregnancy itself. Many women carried babies and built lives around them. It was who the father was that made everything impossible. Lucas Marino wasn't a man who accepted loss or limitation. He collected things. Money, property, loyalty, power. He would have collected me and our child with the same methodical precision he applied to his business interests, and our daughter would have been raised in a world where violence was currency, and trust was a weakness to be eliminated. I'd made a choice that seemed impossible at the time, but became the only option I could live with. I'd fabricated a miscarriage at 22 weeks, complete with medical records that Dr. Harrison and 2 other colleagues had carefully documented. Lucas received the news with the kind of silence that suggested his world had tilted sideways. For 3 days, I waited for him to appear at my apartment, for his men to surround the building, for the explosion of rage I knew was coming. Instead, he disappeared into his business affairs, and I never heard from him directly again. A mutual acquaintance mentioned weeks later that he'd attended a funeral, that he'd seemed diminished somehow, as though grief had carved away pieces of him. What Lucas didn't know was that I was very much alive and still carrying his daughter. The Federal Bureau of Investigation came into my life on a Tuesday, which seemed like poor timing for something that would unravel everything I'd constructed. Special Agent Morrison was professional and unremarkable, the kind of person you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting them if not for their government-issued credentials and the weight of authority they carried. He found me in the clinic parking lot after my shift, stepping out of a nondescript sedan like he'd been waiting for me specifically. "Dr. Jessica Mitchell?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Who's asking?" I kept my keys in my hand, keys positioned between my knuckles because Dr. Harrison had taught me that much, at least. Self-defense for those of us with small daughters dependent on our survival. Special Agent Morrison, FBI. He didn't reach for credentials, just held them up from his pocket. "I'd like to talk about your death certificate." The parking lot suddenly felt too exposed. "I'm not discussing anything without my attorney present. Your attorney would probably tell you that cooperating would be significantly more advantageous than obstruction of a federal investigation." He wasn't threatening exactly. His voice remained conversational, almost friendly. "The falsification of a death certificate is a serious matter, Dr. Mitchell. But we're not interested in prosecuting you. We're interested in understanding why someone in your position would go to such extreme lengths to disappear." Sophia was with her after-school program until 6. I had 45 minutes. "I want immunity," I said. "Complete immunity. Written. Get in the car." The sedan was government-issue practical. Gray interior, minimal comfort, the faint smell of coffee and something chemical underneath. Morrison drove toward the waterfront, a deliberate choice of neutral ground that suggested he'd done this before. He explained as we drove that my original disappearance had been efficient, but not perfect. Records from Johns Hopkins Medical School had been cross-referenced with state licensing databases. Someone had noticed that Dr. Jessica Mitchell, the physician, had been reported dead, yet Dr. Jessica Mitchell, the licensed practitioner, had somehow managed to maintain her credentials in Massachusetts, under a slightly altered name. Small inconsistencies that accumulated. "Someone is looking for you," Morrison said as we pulled into a parking area overlooking the harbor. "Not us. Not federal authorities. Someone far more dangerous." My throat went dry. I didn't need him to specify who. There was only one person whose attention could constitute that particular flavor of threat. "What do they want?" My voice sounded distant, like someone else was speaking. "Information, leverage, that depends on various factors." Morrison turned to face me, his expression genuinely sympathetic in a way that made everything worse. "You have a daughter, 7 years old, born approximately 9 months after you were supposed to have miscarried." Every protective instinct I possessed roared to life. "Sophia has nothing to do with this." "Sophia." He repeated the name like he was confirming something. "That's a beautiful name. Italian origin. Your daughter's father is Italian, isn't he?" "Lucas Marino?" I didn't answer. The question hung in the sedan like something with weight and teeth. "Here's what we know," Morrison continued. 7 years ago, you became romantically involved with a significant player in organized crime. You became pregnant. You disappeared. To anyone who knew Lucas Marino, you died. But you didn't die. You created an entirely new identity and have been working as a cardiologist in Boston under a protective arrangement that, frankly, was somewhat creative in its construction. "What do you want from me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer forming in his expression. "Right now, we want to offer you something. A genuine federal witness protection arrangement. Not the improvised version you have now. Genuine security for you and your daughter. Real documentation. A real life, not one built on falsified records. In exchange for what? Information about Lucas Marino's operations, his structure, his vulnerabilities." I thought of Sophia's lunchbox, the one with the cartoon unicorn on the side. I thought of her small hand in mine as we walked to school. I thought of the life I'd built. Imperfect and fragile, but mine. And then I thought about the fact that people far more powerful than me had already discovered my existence. That Morrison sitting beside me, offering protection, was only the beginning of the attention I was about to receive. "I need time to think," I said. "You have 48 hours. After that, the situation changes." The phone call came during my lunch break, which felt intentionally cruel in its timing. I was sitting in the hospital cafeteria, pushing around a salad I had no appetite for, when the unknown number lit up my screen. I let it ring twice before answering, that old instinct telling me that hesitation mattered. "Dr. Mitchell?" A woman's voice, professional and measured. "My name is Attorney Patricia Summers. I represent several clients whose interests align with your current situation. We need to meet. I don't know what you're talking about. Special Agent Morrison contacted you yesterday. He offered federal protection in exchange for testimony. Before you commit to any arrangement with the Bureau, there are other parties who would like to present alternative options." A pause. "For Sophia's sake, I'd recommend listening." The salad became instantly irrelevant. I set down my fork with deliberate care. "How do you know about my daughter?" "Because the people who employ me have been aware of her existence for some time. Unlike Agent Morrison, we're not interested in prosecution. We're interested in mutual survival." We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in Cambridge, neutral territory that felt absurdly ordinary given the circumstances. Patricia Summers was exactly what her voice suggested. A woman in her 60s wearing charcoal gray with silver jewelry, the kind of person who disappeared into crowds because nothing about her demanded attention. She ordered black coffee and waited until I was seated before she began. "Lucas Marino has been aware that he has a daughter for approximately 14 hours, she said without preamble. "This information came to him through sources within a rival organization called the Versiani family. They discovered Sophia's existence through surveillance of your clinic and cross-referencing of medical records. Their intention is not simply to inform Lucas. Their intention is to create leverage." My chest constricted. "What kind of leverage?" "The kind that involves your child. The Versiani family operates primarily through intimidation and control of assets. A 7-year-old girl connected to one of the most powerful men in the Northeast qualifies as both leverage and a potential weakness they can exploit. They're planning a custody arrangement that would essentially grant them access to Sophia as insurance against Lucas's business decisions. That's kidnapping. Yes. Also known as leverage in certain circles. Patricia sipped her coffee with the calm of someone discussing weather patterns. The timeline is aggressive. They've already positioned people in Boston. The attempt will likely occur within the next 72 hours. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping backward. I'm taking Sophia and leaving. Where will you go? Patricia didn't even glance up from her cup. Agent Morrison knows your address. The Versiani family knows your address. Your license flagged inconsistencies in the National Provider Identifier Registry. The Massachusetts board pulled your file, and federal healthcare auditors noticed the trail. Running stopped being viable yesterday. Then what are you suggesting? I sat back down because the alternative was panic, and panic served no one. Contact Lucas Marino directly. Inform him of the threat. Allow him to provide protection. He'll never let us go. He'll absorb us into his world and... I stopped, because Patricia was shaking her head. He'll absorb you into his world regardless of what you choose. The Versiani family has already made that decision for you. The only question is whether you face that reality with protection or without it. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against the table. How do I contact him? You don't. I do. Patricia slid a business card across the table. It contained nothing but a phone number. Call this number at precisely 8 o'clock tonight. Tell whoever answers that Dr. Mitchell wishes to arrange a meeting with Lucas Marino regarding a matter of family security. They'll coordinate the details. Why would he agree to meet with me after 7 years? Because he has a daughter he didn't know existed. And because men like Lucas Marino don't ignore threats to their bloodline. Because his entire organizational structure is now at risk from a rival family exploiting his weakness. Because you're offering him information about how deeply the Versiani family has infiltrated Boston. Patricia gathered her coffee cup and stood. And because whether he knows it or not, he's been looking for you since you disappeared. This is simply an opportunity for that search to end. After she left, I sat in the coffee shop for another hour, watching people move through their ordinary lives. A couple debated which pastry to purchase. A student worked on a laptop with the intensity of someone racing deadlines. An elderly man read a newspaper that probably contained articles about crime and politics, and all the violence that existed in spaces I'd successfully avoided. The call to Dr. Harrison came next, the man who had facilitated my disappearance and maintained cautious oversight ever since. He listened without interrupting, while I explained the convergence of threats and Attorney Summers's proposal. I'm sorry, he said when I finished. I thought the documentation would hold. I thought enough time had passed that... He stopped himself. You need to talk to Lucas. I'm terrified, I admitted, and the confession felt like stepping off a cliff. Of course you are, but Sophia is in danger either way. At least with Lucas, she has a father who can actually protect her. I'll handle things here. The clinic, your colleagues. If anyone asks questions, you're on an emergency family leave. Sophia was asking about the presentation I'd promised to help with for her school project when I picked her up that afternoon. She wanted to create something about marine biology, apparently inspired by a documentary she'd watched. She talked nonstop during the drive home, her small voice filling the car with enthusiasm about octopuses and their intelligence levels. I listened and responded at appropriate intervals while my mind fractured into different sections, each one occupied by distinct terrors. At exactly 8 o'clock, I called the number on Patricia's card. A man answered on the first ring, his voice carrying an accent that suggested Italian heritage. Is this the woman Lucas has been mourning? He asked, not bothering with pleasantries. This is Jessica Mitchell. I need to meet with Lucas Marino tonight. It concerns the safety of his daughter. A silence followed, the kind that stretched long enough to feel intentional. There is a location. I am sending you an address. The convoy left Boston a little after 9. Past Worcester, the night thinned into long ribbons of highway and rain. By 11:30 we were over the state line, the GPS tracing the Connecticut River Valley like a vein. The estate sat west of Hartford, close enough for supply lines, far enough to be no one's neighbor. 1 hour. Come alone. No phone. No weapons. If you carry documents, they'll be inspected at the door. The address corresponded to a warehouse district near the harbor, the kind of place that existed in the gaps between legitimate Boston and everything that moved through the darkness. I arranged for my neighbor to watch Sophia, told her it was a medical emergency, which technically was true in the most crucial sense. My daughter's entire future constituted emergency. I drove toward the warehouse with my hands steady on the wheel and my heart performing gymnastics against my ribs. The address led me to a converted shipping facility with industrial architecture and minimal signage. A man stood waiting, his posture suggesting military training or something equivalent. He didn't ask questions, simply gestured for me to follow. The interior was all exposed brick and metal, and then suddenly we were in an office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. Rain had begun to fall, the kind of steady precipitation that suggested it would continue indefinitely. And there, backlit by the gray evening light, was Lucas Marino. 7 years had changed him in ways I hadn't anticipated. His frame remained imposing, but something about his bearing suggested a man who'd been carrying weight far heavier than muscle. He turned when I entered, and for a moment nothing moved between us except recognition. "Hello, Jessica," he said, and his voice contained every emotion he'd learned not to display in 7 years of believing I was dead. The rain continued against the warehouse glass, and somewhere in Boston, my daughter slept in the apartment we'd built together, unaware that her entire world was about to shift on its axis. The silence stretched between us like something alive. Lucas stood motionless, his features carved from shadow and harbor light, processing what his eyes were telling him. 7 years of believing I was gone, and now I occupied space in his office like some impossible ghost made flesh. "You're alive," he said finally, and the words carried an inflection I couldn't categorize. Not question. Not quite statement either. "Yes." He turned away from the window, and the movement revealed the true cost of those 7 years. His frame was still imposing, still commanded attention, but the way he held himself suggested someone who'd learned to carry grief like it was structural. A scar I didn't recognize traced his right jawline, puckering down toward his neck. "The child is mine." Not a question. I pulled the documents from my satchel. Birth certificate, Sophia's medical records, photographs spanning 7 years. Each one a small rebellion against the life he would have insisted on. He studied them with the methodical precision of someone reading financial reports, and I watched him reconstruct the mathematics. 7 years and 9 months. The timeline aligned perfectly with the pregnancy he'd mourned, with the daughter he'd never known existed. "Her name is Sophia," I said. "She's 7 years old. She's intelligent and careful, and she plays violin badly but with genuine enthusiasm." Lucas set the documents on his desk with deliberate care. When he looked up at me, his expression had shifted into something harder, more dangerous. "You disappeared from a hospital. You faked your death. You carried my child across state lines and hid her from me for 7 years. He paused, each word becoming a separate sentence. "And you want to tell me about her violin lessons? I want to tell you that she's safe. I want to explain why I made the choice I did. And I want you to listen before you decide what happens next." "I've already decided what happens next." He moved toward me, closing distance with predatory intention. "You're going to tell me everything. Where she is, how you arranged the documentation, who helped you. The Versiani family is planning to take her." I spoke without inflection, stating fact as though his fury hadn't just filled the room like something physical. "They discovered her existence 2 days ago through surveillance of my clinic. They've already positioned people in Boston. They want leverage against you. And Sophia qualifies as both an asset and your weakness." Something flickered across his face. Not fear exactly, but the recognition of a threat to his control. His jaw tightened, and I watched him recalibrate his priorities. "How do you know this?" he demanded. "Because a lawyer named Patricia Summers contacted me and explained the situation with more precision than I would have preferred. Because 3 separate parties are now interested in my daughter's location and my cooperation. Because hiding stopped being viable the moment the FBI started investigating the falsification of my death certificate." Lucas moved to the windows, his silhouette cutting stark against the rain-streaked glass. Boston sprawled below us, all lights and movement, and somewhere in that city was my daughter sleeping in blissful ignorance of the forces converging toward her. "Tell me what they want," he said. I explained the Versiani family's strategy: custody arrangement that would grant them access, insurance against his business decisions, the timeline that suggested they would move within 72 hours. I provided details about the surveillance patterns Patricia had mentioned, the specific locations where Versiani operatives had been positioned. I offered information that wouldn't exist in his intelligence network yet, because it came from sources operating outside traditional crime family channels. The FBI is also involved, I added. Special Agent Morrison approached me about entering witness protection. They want testimony regarding the organized crime connections you've built, but they're secondary to the immediate threat. The Versiani family moves first. Lucas turned from the window and his expression had transformed into something colder than anger. You came here because you need protection. I came here because she needs protection. Because I've exhausted every other option. Because no matter what I choose, Sophia's world has already changed. I met his gaze directly. The FBI will find her eventually. The Versiani family plans to find her in 72 hours. Running with her accomplishes nothing except delaying the inevitable. He nodded, a single gesture laden with consequences. She'll come here tonight. Both of you. I won't allow her to be absorbed into your world as though she's simply another acquisition. She's my daughter. She's already part of my world. His tone suggested he was stating biological fact rather than negotiating. The only question is whether her existence becomes an actual liability, or whether I ensure she becomes untouchable. That's not how this works. You don't get to dictate the terms of this arrangement. His voice dropped, and the danger in it became absolute. You had 7 years to make decisions. That period has concluded. Now I make the decisions. 1 call every Sunday, 30 minutes, he said. No recording, no tracing. If we can't trust the boundary, we change the boundary. Before I could respond, his phone buzzed. He checked it with practiced efficiency, and whatever the message contained shifted his entire demeanor. He made 3 rapid calls, speaking in Italian to people who apparently operated in his immediate orbit. Resources were diverted, locations were secured, personnel were mobilized toward Boston with the efficiency of someone who'd anticipated exactly this scenario. Your daughter requires protection tonight, he said when he finished. My men will be in Boston within 4 hours. You will arrange for Sophia to be removed from her current location. You will bring her to the coordinates I'm about to send you. Lucas, you came to me for protection. You're receiving it. He moved toward his desk and began typing on a laptop with sharp, precise movements. The Versiani family will discover that the resources they've positioned in Boston have become liabilities. Agent Morrison will receive information about his investigation that will cause the FBI to redirect their immediate attention. Your colleagues at the clinic will receive visits from people who will explain that they need to stop cooperating with federal authorities. What are you doing? Eliminating the threats, consolidating control, operating within my capacity as a man with sufficient resources to protect what belongs to him. He turned to face me. Your daughter belongs to me now. That means she's protected in ways you couldn't accomplish alone. That also means certain choices are no longer yours to make. She's my daughter, too. Yes. Which is why you're still alive. He moved closer, and I forced myself not to retreat, despite every survival instinct screaming at me to do so. You had one job when you disappeared. Keep my child safe. You failed that job the moment you allowed the Versiani family to discover her existence. Now, I'm assuming that responsibility. I wanted to argue. I wanted to reassert autonomy and agency and maternal authority. Instead, I simply nodded, because he was right about one thing. Sophia wasn't safe with me. Sophia wasn't safe anywhere except in the orbit of someone powerful enough to make threats inconvenient for her enemies. When can you retrieve her? He asked. Within the hour. Do it. My men will be waiting at these coordinates. He sent the address to my phone. After tonight, she's under my protection. Permanently. The rain had intensified as I made my way back toward the door, each drop hitting the windows with increasing urgency. I paused before leaving. She doesn't know about you, I said. She thinks her father is simply absent. She doesn't understand what you do or who you are. Then I suppose we'll both need to learn how to be parents to each other. Lucas returned to the window, silhouetted once more against the storming city. Tonight, Jessica. Bring her tonight. After that, We discussed the details of how your life integrates into mine. I left him there in the darkness, surrounded by the infrastructure of power he'd spent 7 years constructing. Somewhere in Boston, my daughter was sleeping, unaware that her entire existence had just shifted fundamentally, irrevocably. The property revealed itself gradually as we drove through the gates. Lucas's estate sprawled across manicured grounds with the kind of understated architecture that whispered wealth rather than screamed it. Glass and stone merged seamlessly with landscape design that looked effortless, but probably required armies of maintenance staff. Sophia pressed her face against the car window, her earlier anxiety transforming into curiosity as we descended the private driveway. "Mommy, whose house is this?" she asked, and the innocence in her voice made my chest constrict. "Someone who can help keep us safe," I answered, which was technically accurate even if it failed to capture the complexity of what was actually happening. Lucas waited on the front steps, and I watched him take in Sophia for the first time. She was small for 7, with brown curls that never stayed in the style I attempted, and eyes that held his exact shade of dark. Recognition flickered across his face. Not the shock I'd witnessed in the warehouse office, but something deeper. Ownership. Possession. The understanding that this small human carried his genetic material and would now exist in his orbit indefinitely. "Sophia, this is Lucas," I said carefully. "He's going to help us stay safe for a while." She studied him with the unfiltered assessment children performed without social filters. "Are you a doctor like Mommy?" "No," Lucas said, and something in his tone suggested he was choosing his words with deliberate care. "I handle problems. I make sure people are protected." "That's like what Mommy does." Sophia seemed satisfied with this explanation, but with different problems. Lucas inclined his head slightly. "Exactly." The interior of the house unfolded in layers of carefully curated luxury. A woman in her 60s emerged from the kitchen, her posture suggesting military precision, and her expression indicating she'd managed far more complex situations than harboring a 7-year-old and her protective mother. Lucas introduced her as Rosa, the house manager, and she immediately began assessing Sophia with eyes that held both warmth and professional capability. "The child must be hungry after traveling," Rosa said, her accent suggesting Italian heritage. "I have prepared simple food, nothing complicated for young stomachs." "Sophia," Lucas directed, and his tone carried absolute authority, "go with Rosa. She'll show you to your rooms and ensure you're comfortable." I moved to follow, but Lucas caught my arm with surprising gentleness. "We need to discuss terms." The study was lined with books that suggested serious reading rather than decorative collection. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the grounds, and Lucas positioned himself behind an imposing desk with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to operating from positions of power. "Sophia remains here," he stated, "under constant protection. Medical staff on site. Security that exceeds what any civilian facility could provide. She needs to attend school. She needs routine. She can't be locked in a house. She'll have tutors on site initially. Once the immediate threat from the Verziani family is neutralized, we'll discuss external arrangements." He paused, studying me with an intensity that suggested he was assessing not just my words but my capacity to resist. "You'll remain as well. Not as prisoner. Not as guest. As someone with medical expertise who will ensure both she and I maintain optimal health. I won't be controlled. You're already being controlled by circumstances beyond your authority." His delivery was matter-of-fact rather than cruel. "The FBI seeks your cooperation. The Verziani family seeks leverage. I'm offering structured protection within reasonable parameters. That's not control. That's exchange of services. I need to work. I need my practice. Your practice is currently under FBI scrutiny. Continuing to work there exposes Sophia to ongoing surveillance and potential interference." He leaned back in his chair. "However, I have connections with private medical facilities. You could maintain your license and work within secure environments that don't compromise her safety." The logic was undeniable, which frustrated me more than if he'd simply demanded obedience. "And what exactly are the terms of this arrangement? You provide medical care as needed. You confirm Sophia is being treated appropriately. You don't attempt to leave the property without authorization. You don't contact federal authorities. In exchange, Sophia has security that's effectively impenetrable. You both receive protection from every faction currently interested in your location. That sounds like imprisonment. It sounds like reality. He stood and moved toward the windows. You made a choice when you disappeared with my child. Now I'm making the choices. The only variable is whether you cooperate or resist. Over the following weeks, the arrangement developed its own rhythm. Sophia adapted to the house with the remarkable flexibility of childhood. Rosa established routines that provided structure without oppression. A tutor arrived daily to maintain her education. She discovered a pool and spent afternoons perfecting a doggy paddle that barely qualified as swimming. She learned that Lucas took coffee in the morning without sugar, and that he had a scar because he'd once been careless about his own safety. Patricia Summers called again, I told Lucas. She would, he said, not looking up. Whose side is she on? Her own, he said. She brokers survival. Sometimes that aligns with mine, sometimes with my enemies. She warned you because selling the warning was worth more than selling the silence. So I don't owe her. You don't owe anyone who makes a living from leverage, he said. You just pay the price that keeps you standing. I watched them interact with an emotional complexity I hadn't anticipated. He would appear in doorways and ask about her day with genuine interest. He listened to her descriptions of butterfly species she'd learned about with the attention of someone who actually wanted to understand her thoughts. When she stumbled during a practice run in the hallway, he caught her reflexively, his hands trembling slightly, as though the catch had cost him something. She has your intensity, I observed one evening when Sophia was occupied with Rosa in the kitchen. She has your intelligence. He returned to the book he'd been pretending to read. She also has your stubbornness regarding bedtime protocols. You tried to order her to bed. She negotiated. She suggested that reading by herself for 15 minutes constituted an acceptable compromise. He closed his book. She inherited my flexibility regarding strategy. But the domestic equilibrium fractured when Lucas attempted to assert absolute authority regarding her activities. He made a decision that Sophia was to have no contact with people outside the property. Not phone calls to her former school friends, not letters. Complete isolation justified by security concerns. Absolutely not, I said when I discovered the directive. She's a 7-year-old child, not a strategic asset. She's my daughter, and her safety is non-negotiable. Her psychological health is non-negotiable as well. She needs connection beyond this property and beyond your security apparatus. I met his gaze directly. If you attempt to enforce that isolation, I will leave. I will contact the FBI and negotiate protective custody. I will remove her from your influence entirely. The silence that followed contained the weight of genuine conflict. For the first time since the warehouse office, Lucas faced someone who wouldn't simply accept his edicts. His hand clenched briefly, then released. 2 supervised calls per month, he said finally. To approved individuals only, monitored for security purposes. 1 call per week to 1 friend, unmonitored. You either trust that I won't betray your location or you don't. He looked at me for a long moment, and I watched the calculation move across his face. The recognition that maintaining control required her cooperation. That domination purchased through force would create precisely the resentment that would eventually separate him from his daughter. 1 call per week, he agreed. Sunday afternoons, 30 minutes maximum. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the freedom she deserved. But it was a negotiation, which meant something fundamental had shifted. He'd accepted that parenting involved compromise, and that his daughter's autonomy required respecting boundaries he couldn't simply override. Rosa found me later in the library, where I was pretending to read while actually processing the exchange. He's learning, she said quietly. Slowly. But he's learning that love requires surrender of control. It takes men like him longer to understand this. The attack came on a Wednesday afternoon when everything felt deceptively normal. Sophia was in the pool with Rosa supervising, her laughter echoing across the grounds as she practiced floating on her back. I was in the library reviewing medical journals when Lucas entered with an expression that transformed his entire demeanor into something primal and dangerous. We have a breach, he said without preamble. 2 operatives attempting to bypass the eastern perimeter. I stood immediately. Sophia is secure, Rosa's moving her inside now. He was already moving toward the doors, speaking into an earpiece in rapid Italian. Stay here. Lock this door. Do not open it regardless of what you hear. I locked the library door as instructed, but remaining stationary felt impossible. Through the windows, I could see movement on the property. Guards repositioning, vehicles emerging from garage areas I hadn't known existed. The peaceful estate transformed into something militarized within seconds. The first gunshot shattered the illusion of safety I'd begun cultivating. Then another. My medical training kicked in despite my panic. Gunshots meant injuries. Injuries meant hemorrhage, shock, trauma that required immediate intervention. I ignored Lucas's instruction and moved toward the hallway just as chaos erupted. A guard stumbled past, blood streaming down his arm where a bullet had torn through the bicep. He was going into shock, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Without hesitation, I grabbed his uninjured arm and pulled him into the first aid station I knew was located near the kitchen. Rosa had shown me the location weeks ago, a fully stocked medical room designed for exactly these scenarios. Sit down, now, I commanded, and the authority in my voice overrode his attempt to continue toward Lucas. I worked quickly, assessing the wound. The bullet had entered cleanly, but the exit wound was catastrophic, bleeding heavily. I applied direct pressure with sterile gauze while ripping open an IV kit with my teeth. The guard, Marco, I heard someone shout his name, was pale and shaking. I'd done a trauma year before cardiology. Knife wounds at 3 a.m., gunshots that argued with statistics. The protocols lived in my hands even when adrenaline tried to steal them. You're going into hypovolemic shock, I explained while working. I need to get fluids into you. This is going to hurt. The boss needs me. Marco attempted to move. The boss needs his people alive. Stop moving. I secured the IV line and started saline running at maximum rate. The bleeding was slowing but not stopping. I needed to get him to a proper hospital, but first I had to stabilize him enough to survive transport. Pressure dressing, antibiotics, pain management. My hands moved through protocols I'd performed hundreds of times, except those times had never involved armed intruders and property security measures. Through the aid station window, I watched guards move with tactical precision toward the eastern side of the property. Lucas appeared for a moment, and even from this distance, I could see the lethal focus on his face. This wasn't the man who'd negotiated with me about Sophia's phone calls. This was the infrastructure of violence he'd built his life upon. The firefight lasted maybe 8 minutes, though time compressed into something unmeasurable. Then silence. The kind of silence that suggested the threat had been neutralized or had retreated. I kept working on Marco, managing his vitals and trying to calculate whether he needed emergency transport or if he could survive with my immediate care. Lucas appeared in the aid station doorway, and blood wasn't his. That mattered. He assessed the situation with a single glance and nodded approvingly. The threat is contained, he said. One operative is dead. One is captured. They attempted a direct extraction of Sophia from the pool area. My hands stilled momentarily, despite my effort to maintain composure. If Rosa hadn't already been moving her, if I hadn't immediately, she's safe, Lucas said, and his voice carried an edge of something I'd never heard before. Genuine fear, quickly suppressed. Rosa had her inside the moment the first perimeter alarm triggered. I returned focus to Marco, whose bleeding I'd managed to slow to something manageable. He needs hospital-grade care. The wound is serious but survivable if we get him surgical intervention within the next 2 hours. Ambulance arrives in 20 minutes, Lucas confirmed. You did well. Efficiently. You saved his life. I did what any medical professional would do. Most medical professionals would have panicked or attempted to hide. He watched me work with an intensity that suggested he was reconsidering something fundamental. You assessed the situation and acted. That's not standard civilian behavior. I'm not a standard civilian. I applied fresh gauze to the exit wound. I've treated gang violence patients in Boston emergency rooms. I know what trauma looks like. The paramedics arrived and I briefed them quickly on Marco's condition, medications administered, IV placement. They loaded him with practiced efficiency, and I watched the ambulance depart down the private drive. When I turned back, Lucas was still watching me with an expression I couldn't quite categorize. Reassessment. Recognition. possibly something approaching respect. "Come with me," he said. The interrogation room, because that's clearly what it was, despite the euphemistic term secure office, contained a man who looked precisely like what he was. Versiani operative, early 40s, scarred, with the bearing of someone accustomed to violence. His left eye was swelling where Lucas's men had clearly encouraged cooperation. "This is Dr. Mitchell," Lucas said calmly. "She's going to explain why your organization's plan has failed." The operative's gaze flicked toward me with confusion, then back to Lucas. "Tell me what you were instructed to accomplish," Lucas directed. The operative remained silent. Lucas nodded, and one of his men moved toward the captive. Before he could make contact, I stepped forward. "Your objective was to extract my daughter and hold her for ransom," I said, and my voice was steady despite the trembling in my chest. "Create a public spectacle that would humiliate Lucas and create leverage for future negotiations." The operative's expression shifted slightly, confirmation that I'd understood correctly. "That plan has several flaws," I continued. "First, your organization didn't account for the fact that Sophia doesn't leave this property without security detail. Second, you didn't anticipate that the medical staff on site are equipped to handle tactical situations. Third, you failed to understand that Lucas doesn't negotiate when his family is threatened. He eliminates threats." "Very impressive," the operative said, his voice carrying an accent that suggested Eastern European origins. "The little girl's mother. How touching." Lucas moved with sudden violence, slamming the operative's head against the table. Blood streamed from the man's nose. "You attempted to take my child," Lucas said quietly. "You threatened her physical safety. Every choice you make from this moment forward determines whether you survive the night or whether I ensure your organization understands that particular mistake has become fatal." The interrogation continued for another hour, Lucas extracting information about Versiani's positioning, their resources in Boston, their timeline for escalation. I stood nearby, ostensibly as medical observer, but actually as witness to the reality of Lucas's world. This wasn't abstraction. This wasn't theoretical danger. This was the specific mechanics of how he maintained control. When it was concluded, Lucas led me away from the interrogation room and back through the house. We found Sophia in the main living area, curled against Rosa with a book, seemingly unaffected by the morning's violence. Children possessed remarkable resilience or remarkable trauma denial. I hadn't yet determined which. "She's safe," Rosa assured me. She heard nothing, saw nothing. But I saw the way Lucas looked at his daughter, the recognition of how close he'd come to losing her, the acknowledgement that my original fear, that Sophia would be absorbed into his criminal world as merely another asset, had been naive. She wasn't just an asset. She was his daughter, and that meant something to him that transcended business calculations. Later that evening, Lucas found me in the library. The property had returned to its normal security protocols, though enhanced now. Additional cameras, patrol patterns modified, contingency plans clearly activated. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For saving Marco. For remaining clear-headed during the attack. For understanding the threat and responding appropriately." He paused. "And for confirming something I needed to understand." "What?" "That you're not simply a beautiful woman who happened to carry my child. You're capable, intelligent, brave in ways that matter." He moved closer. "I've spent 7 years believing I wanted you back. Now I'm recognizing that what I actually want is someone who can stand beside me in this world, someone who understands it without requiring protection from its realities. I should have felt manipulated, should have recognized this as a calculation designed to make me more compliant. Instead, I felt seen in a way that terrified and exhilarated me simultaneously. He wasn't asking me to be less. He was acknowledging that I'd become more. 6 weeks became 2 months, and the rhythm of the estate settled into something resembling normal. Sophia stopped asking when we could leave. She stopped counting days on the calendar Rosa had provided. Instead, she began asking when Lucas would return from his meetings, whether he preferred tea or coffee, if he'd watched the documentary about dolphins she'd seen last week. The transformation from temporary refuge to permanent residence happened gradually. Then suddenly, with the weight of inevitability behind it, I watched them together during breakfast one morning. Sophia was describing her tutoring session with meticulous detail, explaining how she'd finally understood the concept of fractions by using chocolate divided into squares. Lucas listened with focused attention, asking questions that demonstrated genuine interest rather than obligatory engagement. His scarred jaw softened when she laughed at her own explanation of how she'd almost eaten the learning materials. "You're good with her," I said later, finding him in the study reviewing documents. "She's easy to love," he replied, without looking up. "She has your intelligence and your ability to find humor in complications." It was the first time he'd voluntarily connected me to something positive about Sophia. The acknowledgement felt significant. "We should discuss what happened," I said, and he finally met my gaze. 7 years ago. Why I did what I did. Why I never contacted you. He set down his pen with deliberate care. "Sit down, Jessica." I expected anger. I anticipated defensive justifications for his world and his choices. Instead, he simply waited while I arranged myself in the chair across from his desk. "I was terrified," I began, and the admission felt like stepping off a ledge. "When I realized I was pregnant, everything I understood about you crystallized into something impossible. You operated in an environment where violence was operational strategy, where loyalty was purchased through fear or obligation, where family members were viewed as leverage. I couldn't bring a child into that reality, so you created a fiction instead." His voice held no accusation, just observation. "I created an alternative." I held his gaze. "Yes, it was built on lies. But it was built on the principle that Sophia deserved a childhood unburdened by your world. She deserved safety that wasn't predicated on her value as leverage. And did you find that safety?" he asked quietly. "In Boston, alone, raising her with fabricated documentation and constant vigilance against discovery." "No," I admitted, "which is precisely why I'm here. Because your world, terrifying as it is, apparently provides what I couldn't build alone." He stood and moved to the windows, his silhouette becoming familiar in a way that unsettled me. 7 years of absence had created distance that his physical presence hadn't actually bridged. "When you disappeared, I lost something I didn't realize mattered that much," he said without turning. "Not just you. Not just the child I didn't know existed. I lost something fundamental about how I understood myself. I spent 7 years becoming harder, colder, more willing to employ violence as solution. Your absence created space for those parts of me to expand unchecked. That's not my responsibility. I'm not assigning responsibility." He finally turned. "I'm offering explanation. The brutality I'm known for now, the ruthlessness that causes other families to avoid direct conflict with mine, that evolved in the years after you died, or at least after I believed you'd died. You could have chosen differently." "Yes, I could have. Instead, I chose to make certain that anyone who threatened my territory understood the cost of that threat. I became the monster everyone needed me to be, because I was grieving someone I couldn't acknowledge losing." He moved closer. "Do you understand what that means? That you blame me for your choices. That I'm explaining why your choice to disappear had consequences you couldn't have anticipated. That your absence shaped not just my life, but the lives of every person who's encountered my organization. That I need you to understand the weight of what you set in motion." The accusation hung between us like something with substance. I wanted to defend my choice. I wanted to explain that self-preservation required distance from his world. Instead, I sat with the reality that both of us had made decisions that rippled outward in ways neither could have controlled. "I'm sorry," I said finally, "for the impact of my choice. I'm not sorry for making it, because Sophia needed protection from a reality she wasn't born to inhabit. But I understand now that my actions created consequences I didn't authorize." He sat back down, studying me with an intensity that suggested reassessment. "I've spent 7 years believing I wanted you back, because I loved you. Now I'm recognizing that what I actually wanted was to undo the loss, to reclaim something I'd decided was mine. And now I understand that you're not something I reclaim. You're someone I either partner with or lose completely. There's no middle ground available to us." He opened a drawer and withdrew documents. "These are updated identification papers. Completely legitimate. These are updated identification papers. Legitimate. The case against you is closed. A consent agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office and the State Board restores your legal identity without admitting wrongdoing. No aliases. No program handlers. Your life, on paper, is clean. Should you choose to leave, you have the option. Sophia can remain here under my guardianship, or you can both depart. The choice belongs entirely to you. Morrison didn't call. He sent a letter, typed, unsigned, the kind that lives in filing cabinets and never warms to fingerprints. We appreciate your cooperation to date. I read it twice. I hadn't cooperated, not formally. Maybe the system had decided it wanted one less loose thread. Or maybe one man with a badge had decided a mother and a child weren't the place to draw a hard line. I stared at the papers without touching them. Why are you offering this? Because love, apparently, requires offering freedom, even when you'd prefer to impose constraints. His voice carried something that might have been bitterness, or might have been acceptance. Because keeping someone through force is simply imprisonment, and I won't do that to you. Because you deserve the autonomy to choose your life, rather than having it decided through my authority. The weight of what he was offering felt catastrophic. Genuine choice, actual freedom. The knowledge that staying wouldn't be compliance but decision. What happens if I stay? I asked. Then we build something that's not based on loss or possession. Something constructed between two people who understand each other's capacity for survival and strategic thinking. Whether that includes romantic involvement remains to be determined by both of us. But it would be built on foundation of mutual respect rather than my domination. I picked up the documents and set them aside unopened. I need time to process this. You have all the time you need, he said, and meant it. That night, I watched Sophia sleep in the room that had become genuinely hers. Her violin sat in the corner, her school materials organized on the desk, her possessions accumulated into the artifacts of belonging. The question wasn't whether I could build a life here. The question was whether I could accept that staying meant acknowledging that my world had fundamentally changed, and that change wasn't entirely negative. The evening Sophia asked me directly when we were leaving was the moment I understood that staying had already become my choice, whether I'd consciously made it or not. We were in her room after dinner, and she was arranging her violin on its stand with careful precision. The instrument had arrived 2 weeks earlier, a quality upgrade from the student model she'd been learning on in Boston. Lucas had ordered it without consulting me, which should have irritated me, but instead felt like acknowledgement that she would remain long enough to require advancement. We're not leaving, are we? Sophia asked without looking at me. The question deserved honesty. Do you want to? She finally turned, and her expression carried a maturity that 7 years old shouldn't possess. I like it here. I like Rosa. I like that Lucas asks about my lessons. I like that I don't have to be quiet anymore. In Boston, she'd learned early that visibility attracted complications. She'd learned to move through the world carefully, to avoid drawing attention, to keep herself small. Here, in this fortress, she'd expanded into her natural personality. The irony wasn't lost on me. After she slept, I found myself standing at the windows of Lucas's study, watching the grounds settle into nighttime darkness. The property had become familiar in ways that spoke to permanence. I knew which hallways creaked. I knew that Rosa took her evening tea in the kitchen around 9. I knew that Lucas reviewed documents in his office until nearly midnight. His concentration absolute. Knowledge that accumulated into belonging. The attack at the pool 3 weeks ago still existed in my peripheral awareness. The recognition that Sophia had been vulnerable, not because of my failure, but because no single person's protection could be comprehensive against organized forces. Lucas's security had proven superior not through any superiority I could have provided, but through infrastructure and resources that only someone in his position commanded. I was terrified. The acknowledgement felt like stepping off a ledge. Not of Lucas or his world, though those warranted fear. I was terrified of the reality that I'd spent 7 years believing I could protect Sophia through isolation, and that belief had been systematically dismantled. The Versiani family would still operate after I left if I left. The FBI would still investigate. The only difference would be that Sophia faced those threats without the protection Lucas had already proven capable of providing. He found me at the windows without my having heard him enter. That had become typical. His movement through space contained the silence of someone trained in violence. "You've been quiet for 3 days," he said. "I've been thinking. About leaving." It wasn't a question. About whether I'm using that as escape, or whether I'm actually contemplating it. He moved to stand beside me, maintaining distance that felt respectful. "And which is it?" "I realized something after the pool incident," I said. "I realized that my mythology about independence was precisely that. Mythology. The belief that I could build something sustainable for Sophia through isolation. But isolation doesn't create safety. It creates vulnerability disguised as autonomy. That's not a revelation," he said quietly. "That's acceptance of reality. The distinction matters." I finally turned to face him. "I came here because I had no alternative. I stayed because you offered protection. But if I'm committing to this, to remaining, to building something with you, it has to be through choice that's actually informed. Not desperation, repackaged as decision. Meaning I need to understand what I'm choosing. Not just Sophia's security, though that matters. What does partnership look like with someone like you? What does it demand from me?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I watched him construct his response with the precision he applied to everything. "7 years ago, you made a choice that I didn't understand," he began. "You carried my daughter away from me. You built a life specifically designed to exclude me. I was angry about that. Furious, actually. But I've had time to recognize something about that anger." He paused. "I was angry because you'd made a choice that I couldn't control. That I still can't control. Is that supposed to be comforting?" "No. It's supposed to be honest." He met my gaze. "I understand now why you disappeared. I understand that you looked at me and saw someone who would absorb you and your child into his world without consent. I understand that you were protecting her by leaving. I don't forgive you for doing it, because forgiveness suggests you did something wrong. You did what survival demanded. I'm simply acknowledging that now. The distinction mattered. Forgiveness would have implied judgment, followed by absolution. Understanding felt more fundamental. If I stay, I said slowly, it's not because I'm surrendering to your authority. It's because I recognize that protection through partnership is stronger than protection through isolation. It's because Sophia deserves to know her father. It's because I'm exhausted from carrying everything alone. Those are acceptable reasons, he said. And what do you want from this arrangement? Besides the obvious leverage of having me and Sophia under your control, I want someone who understands what I do without requiring me to sanitize it. Someone who can stand beside me in this world without flinching every time I make a decision that involves necessary violence. He stepped closer. I want partnership with someone who has the intelligence to challenge me when I'm making mistakes, and the capability to survive the consequences of those mistakes. You're describing a partner in crime, not a romantic relationship. I'm describing what I actually need, he said. Romantic attachment is secondary to the foundation that has to exist first. Though if we're successful at building that partnership, romance becomes inevitable. I considered this. The pragmatism appealed to me in ways that grand declarations of passion never could. This wasn't seduction. This was negotiation. I want autonomy, I said. Professional autonomy, personal autonomy. I want to continue practicing medicine. I want to maintain relationships outside this property. I want Sophia to have experiences that aren't entirely contained within your security apparatus. Agreed. You can't make that agreement without establishing parameters. What counts as acceptable risk? What relationships are permitted? What constitutes sufficient security? Those are details we establish together, he said. Not through my authority, but through mutual decision-making. That requires trust. Yes, it does. The rain had started while we were talking. Gentle precipitation that suggested continuation rather than storm. Through the windows, I could see it gathering on the glass, individual drops merging into rivulets. Sophia slept upstairs. The property hummed with security protocols I'd stopped bothering to fully comprehend. My life existed in this space now, not as captive but as inhabitant, who'd chosen the confinement through recognition that the alternative was worse. I'm staying, I said finally. Not because I have nowhere else to go, because I've accepted that nowhere else would be better, because Sophia is already rooted here, because I'm tired of running. Lucas reached out slowly, giving me opportunity to move away. And when I didn't, he took my hand. The contact was simple. The significance was everything. The paperwork arrived in a manila envelope marked with federal seals. 3 separate documents detailed the permanent transition of my legal status from temporary witness protection to established identity. Jessica Mitchell, officially recognized, completely legitimate. The irony of legitimacy achieved through an organization designed to obscure identities wasn't lost on me. Your colleagues are safe, Lucas said, setting a separate folder on the desk beside the federal documents. Dr. Harrison received assurances that federal investigation has concluded. The other physicians who assisted you were determined to be coerced rather than complicit. Charges have been dropped across the board. I opened the folder and found detailed documentation of how that had occurred. Legal arguments structured precisely to expose FBI overreach. Testimony from sources within the organization that indicated intimidation, rather than willing participation. The machinery of Lucas's world had moved through legitimate channels to accomplish an outcome that served my interests. How? I asked. I have attorneys who specialize in complicated situations, he replied, and I recognized the understatement. They found inconsistencies in the federal investigation that suggested prosecutorial misconduct. Once those were highlighted, the Bureau found it advantageous to close the matter. Sophia appeared in the doorway, her violin case in hand. She'd begun attending sessions with an instructor who came to the property twice weekly. The arrangement felt deliciously normal, despite its extraordinary context. "Lucas, I'm ready," she announced, and he looked up from his documents with the kind of focus he typically reserved for business matters. "Then let's hear what you've learned this week," he said, gesturing for her to proceed. She opened the case and withdrew the instrument, positioning it with the seriousness of someone who understood the value of her father's attention. The piece she played was simple, but executed with genuine effort. Not perfect, but sincere. When she finished, Lucas applauded with genuine appreciation, rather than performative encouragement. "Remarkable progress," he said. "Your left-hand positioning has improved significantly." Sophia beamed with the kind of pride that only genuine recognition from an authority figure could generate. She repacked her violin and excused herself, leaving us alone once more. "She's asking when she can attend school," Lucas said without preamble. "Regular school, with other children her age." "Is that possible?" "Increasingly." He leaned back in his chair. "The Verciani threat has been substantially neutralized. They lost operatives, resources, and credibility when their extraction attempt failed. Other organizations have begun recognizing that threatening my family incurs costs exceeding potential benefits." I understood what he was saying beneath the words. The world had settled into a new configuration, where Sophia's security was integrated into Lucas's reputation. Harming her would be interpreted as unprecedented disrespect. He'd made her untouchable through the same mechanisms that made him dangerous. "What about my practice?" I asked. "I've arranged access to a private medical facility in Hartford, 12 miles from the property. You can establish a legitimate cardiology practice there. Federal authorities won't interfere because your situation has been officially resolved. Patients will be carefully vetted to ensure no security complications arise." The fact that carefully vetted meant Lucas's operatives would investigate anyone seeking my medical services was something I'd accepted as necessary trade-off. Autonomy within parameters remained preferable to autonomy without safety. That evening, Sophia was asleep by 9. I moved through the quiet house with the familiarity of someone who'd inhabited it long enough to understand its rhythms. The library called to me, and I found myself selecting a novel I'd abandoned weeks ago. Reading became impossible when Lucas arrived back at the house around midnight. He moved through the doorway, with barely noticeable favoring of his left side. I set down my book immediately and approached him. "What happened?" I asked, already scanning for visible injuries. "Nothing significant. A situation in Boston required my presence. A rival family attempted to re-establish presence in our territory." The discussion became somewhat physical. I lifted his shirt, revealing fresh bruising along his ribs. No cuts, no bleeding, but the kind of damage that suggested genuine confrontation rather than minor disagreement. "Sit," I commanded, and he complied without resistance. I retrieved the medical kit I'd begun keeping in the library's lower cabinet. Examination revealed no fractured ribs, but significant bruising. I applied pressure with practiced efficiency, documenting the injury in my mental catalog of his various scars and marks. "You should have someone look at this," I said, though I was someone. I was his someone, apparently. "I do," Lucas replied, watching me work. "You." The moment contained nothing dramatic. No declaration, no orchestrated romance. Simply the recognition that I'd become someone he trusted with his vulnerability, that I'd accepted a role that transcended the categories I'd originally attempted to maintain. "This is becoming a pattern," I observed, applying topical medication to the worst of the bruising. "I'm aware," he said. "Consider it evidence that our partnership is constructing itself through practical necessity rather than theoretical agreement." Sophia arrived in the study doorway, half asleep, seeking water before fully settling into sleep. She took in the scene without alarm, apparently having absorbed the reality that her father's world involved occasional physical complications. "Lucas got hurt again," she said to me, not as accusation but as statement of fact she'd internalized. "Nothing serious," I assured her. "Go back to bed. I'm taking care of it." She accepted this explanation and wandered back toward her room, and I continued my work on Lucas's ribs while moonlight filtered through the windows. The light was gentle rather than dramatic, silver rather than golden, illuminating the ordinary domesticity of a woman treating her partner's injuries while their daughter slept upstairs. This was life now. Complicated, dangerous in ways I couldn't fully control, structured around a man whose profession would never become respectable, but it was also stable. Sophia had a father who loved her intelligently. I had professional autonomy and genuine security. We existed in a configuration that wasn't the life I'd originally envisioned, but had become the life I'd consciously chosen. "Thank you," Lucas said, as I secured the final bandage. The gratitude encompassed more than medical attention. I didn't respond with words. Instead, I allowed my hand to rest on his chest for a moment longer than clinical necessity required. The contact meant everything. We'd constructed something between us that defied simple categorization. Not romance exactly, though elements of that existed. Not partnership in business, though practical cooperation defined us. Something else entirely. Something built through mutual understanding of what survival actually required.